Hi, I'm Melissa from the Yarn Barn, and today let's talk about floating selvages. So what is a floating selvage? It is a single warp thread on either side of your fabric that has a special purpose. It's designed to force every weft pick to go all the way to the edge of the fabric before turning back into the next shed. And it gives the fabric a more uniform, sturdier edge. So let's look at some fabrics that have a floating selvage and some examples that don't have a floating selvage. This is a sample that we are weaving here in the store. It's going to be a napkin, and the structure is a variation on twill. And this is a good example of a situation where you would want to use a floating selvage. So let's look at the edge and explore why you want to use a floating selvage here. So here is the edge of our fabric, and this portion right here was woven using a floating selvage. So this section is plain weave and this section is the twill. And you can see that it's just a good, uniform, even edge. Now, just to show what it would look like without the floating selvage, and here's the floating selvage, so I'm going to take this out of the picture. This is what the fabric edge looked like without the floating selvage. So you've got these kind of short floats, and then this really long float. When I changed the threading or the treadling sequence, then this long float happened, and it got caught a little bit later, but then was just going to continue to float. So this is an example where if you didn't use a floating selvage, you'd get these weird long loops of warp that aren't going to be as stable as you'd want them to be, and they just don't look very good. So that's when you want to use a floating selvage. Now, so what is a floating selvage on the loom? So this is our floating selvage, and it's the same yarn as these other warp ends, and it goes through the reed just like the other warp ends do with the same spacing. And then through the reed, it goes backward, but all of the other threads are going through heddles. This one doesn't go through the heddle. So it goes just straight back to the back beam and then over the back, just like the other warp ends. Because on this jack loom, all of the warp ends that go through heddles are lowered slightly by the weight of the harnesses. And this one isn't going through a heddle, it's higher than the other threads. But when you step on a treadle and raise threads, it's now lower than the raised threads, but it's higher than the threads that aren't lifted. And so it's kind of midway or floating. Now we have one on both sides. And so that allows the weft to go all the way to the left and then all the way to the right. So let's look at how you use it. We're going to put the shuttle in over the floating selvage. But on the other side, we're bringing it out under the floating selvage. And because of that, you can see it has wrapped that floating selvage right there. And then now I'm going to go back into the shed. Again, even though this is the right side and I started on the left side, I'm doing the same thing on the right side. I'm going in over the floating selvage and coming out under the floating selvage. And so now I've wrapped the last thread, the floating selvage, on this side. And then if you look kind of here, you can see that it has been wrapped for that first pick, and then we're going to wrap it again. So it came out under the floating selvage and it's going in over the floating selvage here. And we go like that. And then so now all of this kind of drama that was happening here with a warp end not getting caught at all for a section, that's just going to go away, and we're going to wrap it every single time. So how do you add a floating selvage to your warp? The easiest time to do it is when you're measuring the warp. And I typically simply add one thread on either side, and I use the same color and yarn that I'm using for whatever the next most outside thread would be. So in the case of our sample here, it's the sandy color, so I use the same sandy color for the floating selvage. Now, occasionally we've used 2 threads as a floating selvage when making a rug, just to give it a little bit of extra stability. But a floating selvage is not intended to prevent draw-in. It's only intended to provide a stopping and turning point for the weft. So if you're having trouble with draw-in, then you can solve that with a temple, or beading on an open shed, or just making sure to allow a ton of slack with every weft pick. But don't expect the floating selvage will solve that problem for you. Now, what happens if you're already weaving and you suddenly discover, ooh, I didn't think that was going to happen, but I'm getting this weird looking edge? You can add a floating selvage. Now, you probably are going to want to unweave what you've woven, but then you can tie a floating selvage on either side, just like as if you were repairing a broken thread, or if you were, if you've misthreaded and you need to add a thread, just tie it onto the apron bar, put it through the reed, bypass the heddles, go straight through to the back, and then hang it off the back like you would a repaired thread. And then you're good to go. You can, if you don't want to add a thread for some reason, you can convert the outer thread that was in a heddle. You can simply take that out of the heddle and then put it back through the reed. I'm not really sure, I guess if you're out of the warp thread you used or something like that, that outer thread that was in a heddle can become a floating selvage simply by taking it out of the heddle. It's pretty easy. Let's look at a couple of different examples of when you might want to use a floating selvage, or maybe you don't have to. So let's look at an example of that. So this is an example of another fabric that is twill based, and this section has been woven using a floating selvage. This section has not. And this is a good example to consider where there might be a time that structurally a floating selvage is indicated, but maybe for the particular fabric you're doing, you might think, well, maybe I don't need that. So let's look here where the floating selvage is happening. You can see the weft picks are going all the way to the edge and being captured by the floating selvage. And because the outside thread is the same color, we've got 2 blue warp ends on the end, you're getting kind of a stripe, or definitely a design element here. So it's pretty distinctive. And when you look at the piece as a whole, you see pattern, 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 and blue and blue. So that's part of the design. If you didn't want such a heavy blue line here, you could possibly decide to skip the floating selvage. And in these cases, you can see, like here, the blue weft goes to the next to last thread, because this blue thread is actually one that goes through a heddle. It's not a floating selvage. This blue thread doesn't capture that one. This one doesn't capture the blue thread. And so you're getting some threads that don't make it all the way to the edge, but these aren't long floats. And this actually, I think, looks pretty good, even without the floating selvage. So there are circumstances, it's your weaving, you can do whatever you want to, where you might say, you know what, it's going to be plenty stable even without a floating selvage, and I like this look better. So when it's your weaving, you can do whatever gives you the look you want. So we just talked about an example of a fabric where maybe you'd use a floating selvage, but maybe you might decide that you didn't want to. This is monk's belt, and this is a good example of a fabric where not using the floating selvage is going to cause some trouble to the design. So here we've got blocks that are pattern blocks, and in this area we have ground fabric. And so I'm putting in this pattern block. Here I've used the floating selvage, which is right here. But now let me show you what happens if I don't use the floating selvage. So instead of coming out under the floating selvage, I'm just going to ignore it. And then I will throw my tabby weft. And then now when I go to throw the next pattern weft, this whole area that was supposed to be pattern has no pattern at all. So in this case, using the floating selvage is vital for this outer portion to be represented in the pattern area. Previously, I said that my technique for putting the shuttle into the shed with a floating selvage is in over the floating selvage and out and under the floating selvage. But here's an example of where that might not be the best option. So if you look at this, if I just snug that up a little bit, this edge looks great, just regular plain weave. But when you look at this edge, and maybe more importantly, when you feel this other edge, it feels thicker. And when you look closely, you realize that the floating selvage and the last end that's in a heddle are moving together 100% of the time. So it's like this last warp end is a doubled end. And there's nothing really wrong with that. And there are some circumstances where I might just let that be. I don't want to get rid of the floating selvage in this particular piece because I need it to keep these blocks going all the way to the edge. If that weren't the case, I might just consider not having a floating selvage on this side, but I do need it. So for the sections here that are plain weave, I can do something a little bit different. I decided I just needed to experiment with different ways of handling the shuttle to see what would give me the best looking edge. So one option is just changing the side that I'm putting the shuttle in on. Now, rather than cutting the yarn for this, demonstrating this, I'm just gonna pass it under this way and put it on the other side, just to see, does that make a difference? Let's see. And after throwing a few picks here, I can see that, yes, it has completely solved the problem on this side. However, it has transferred the problem to this side. So it really isn't a good solution because it's really shifted where the problem is, but hasn't made the problem go away. So on this side, these threads are independent from one another, but then on this side, the two outer threads are now moving as one. So they're making a little bit of a more visible edge and one that feels a little bit denser. So that really wasn't the solution that I was hoping it would be. So let's try something different. So instead of going in over the floating selvage and coming out under, let's try going in over and coming out over when I'm going left to right. Yes. And then when I'm going right to left, going in under and coming out under. So we're just wrapping the thread in different ways. And that,
I just want just count.
and so that has solved it. So now on the right-hand selvage, we've got the two outer threads, the floating selvage and the first warp end that's going through a heddle. They are working independently from one another, making a true plain weave. And then on this side, the same thing is happening. So that double thickness that we were seeing earlier has completely disappeared. Now that does take a little bit more concentration. So it's just up to you to decide whether it's worth it for you. And for some projects, that might be completely invisible anyway, so nothing to worry about. But for something that's fine, or a gift, or something that you're going to be looking at a lot, it might be worth kind of experimenting with how to handle the floating selvage and getting the look that's the best one for you. So sometimes the floating selvage might not float as much as you want it to, and that can be because it's getting a little bit slack, or it could just be some aspect of the yarn makes it want to cling to the thread next to it, or it could be sometimes just kind of the design of the loom that makes it a little bit harder to have a floating selvage that rises very high. So there's a fix for that. Ideally, you want the floating selvage to be kind of like that. That way it's easy to come over, but also easy to go under without having to touch the selvage threads very much. I've just taken a length of yarn, and this is just scrap yarn, but it's smooth so that the floating selvage can kind of slide over it. And I'm going to bring it down and catch underneath the floating selvage, and then tie it up over the castle. And not every loom has a high castle like this, but there's generally something you could consider tying it to, and just kind of experiment until you find something that works. But then as I tighten this, I'm lifting the floating selvage, and then by stepping on the treadles, you can lift it up to the position that's kind of right in the middle of the shed. So halfway between the lower shed and the upper shed, as you're weaving. And that then makes it easier to get the shuttle in over and come out under, or whatever combination of over and under you end up using. It speeds things up because you're not having to kind of fiddle with the shuttle to get to it when there's plenty of space above and below the floating selvage. We are now back at the first sample that we looked at, and here's the floating selvage coming from the front of the loom toward the back beam. And one thing to be aware of as you're weaving is that the floating selvage can become slack as you're weaving, kind of for two reasons. One is that it does do a lot of moving, so if it's inclined to stretch a little bit, being on the edge where it's getting some friction from the shuttle can make it stretch a little bit. But the bigger issue is that these weft picks that are going to the floating selvage and around it, they're wrapping the floating selvage. They're not actually forcing it to flex like all of the other warp threads are flexing where it's interacting with the weft. So because it's not flexing, its take-up is less than the take-up on the rest of the warp, and so it can grow slack from that as well. It's an easy fix, super easy, and doesn't cost anything. So here at the Yarn Barn, we're good improvisers, so if you need just a little bit, if it's only a little bit slack, clothespin works. Just isolate the floating selvage, and then down below the back beam, hang the clip on it. Or if you need a little bit more weight, a binder clip and a washer can work. Again, just isolate it, put the binder clip on it, and let it hang. Or if that's too much, maybe a paper clip with a Sharpie. Use what you have and just firm it up just a little bit, not too much, because if you put too much tension on it, it's prone to breakage. So just put a little bit of light weight on it to help tighten it up, and then you're back to weaving. I hope this has taken some of the mystery out of a floating selvage and you feel comfortable using it the next time you plan a project. Thanks.